Thank you very much, Natasha. Ms. van Staveren, thank you for being here tonight with us. In this series, we explore how economics is at the basis of radical systemic change. And I'd like to kick off with getting a grasp on the most urgent and perhaps fundamental problems with today's economic system. Today, we live in a capitalist society. What do you think is the most common myth about capitalism? And can you debunk it?
Yes, I think there are two myths about capitalism. One, that we need capitalism in order to sustain our well-being, and particularly also to allow the well-being of people in developing countries. And again, there's another myth that the only alternative to capitalism is communism. And a state-run planned economy. And well, for this, we know how this ended. And of course, we should not want more of that. So what I would like to see is that people don't confuse capitalism with markets, or capitalism with well-functioning, effective markets. The interesting thing is that capitalism is an economic system in which the market dominates, but went completely out of balance with the coordinating supportive role of the state, the redistributive role of the state on the one hand, and with the role of communities on the other hand. So the market dominates. And I think the important insight, once you see that, is that we can have a very different economy that is not capitalist, but that still relies to some extent, to a large extent, on markets. So we can have a market economy that is not necessarily a capitalist economy.
All right. So why do you think that most people believe that a capitalist society should automatically go hand in hand with a market-sized society?
Well, that relates to economics as a science. When Adam Smith wrote about the role of the market, capitalism was developing, was emerging, but actually the system of feudalism was still very strong. So Adam Smith argued against feudalism and favored the role of markets. 100 years later came Karl Marx. And in his days, we've seen the downsides, the negative effects of a market economy that turned into a capitalist economy. So, yeah, what we can learn from that is rereading Marx's book Capital. I did that 2-3 years ago again, after I read it the first time when I was a student. I must warn people, it's terribly boring, it's badly written, full of repetitions. But what I decided to do is to read it between the lines. And then I discovered that it's not private property that is the major culprit of capitalism going wild. But it's two other mechanisms that characterize capitalism. So Marx mentioned two key characteristics of capitalism, which we can change without having to say goodbye to markets. So actually, I think it's a very optimistic way of looking at the problems of capitalism. So these two mechanisms. One is the asymmetry between capital and labor. Capital hires labor, and it's never the other way around. The other asymmetry, Marx compared the exchange in a general market, markets as we know them for thousands of years, that start with a good. So you start with a good. For example, you have an apple tree, and that provides more apples than you can eat. So you start with the goods, and you want to offer these additional apples to get something else in exchange, a good that is valuable to you, and so on. So the good is central, and that automatically, such exchanges automatically lead to mutually beneficial exchanges. In capitalism, however, the whole exchange starts, the sequence starts with money, with capital. And that is invested in no matter what, as long as it provides maximum rents or dividends or whatever return on investment for the investor. So that may be through producing goods, but as we've seen in the analysis of the financial crisis, it's not through producing real goods and services, but investing in all kinds of fancy financial derivatives. So if we address these two issues, exchange not starting with money and with goods as just a means, but with goods and money just as a means of exchange, and break through the asymmetry of capital hiring labor, then I think we can develop a market economy that is delivering well-being, much more equally spread, and it is also much easier then to move towards a more sustainable economy.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. van Staveren. So if I understand you correctly, there's a way of reading Marx without leading necessarily, which doesn't necessarily lead to communism, and from which the insights from Marx we can still use today in today's economy and in the way we think about economy.
Right, yes.
So one could say that change starts with the way we look at the world, and our worldview is obviously shaped to some extent by the education that we receive. And you, as a pluralist economist, have been vocal about the necessity of pluralism within the economic sciences. Why do you think that this particular neoclassical paradigm is so popular and so dominant within economics? And why do these insights, for example, from Marx, why are they so hard to find within economic sciences these days?
Well, there's not enough time to go into all the factors. But once one paradigm has become relatively more dominant, then starts a kind of vicious circle in which you are locked into that paradigm, and so a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. When I studied economics in the 1980s, there was still Keynesianism in the university, and indeed I could choose subjects on Keynesianism. Marx was not taught anymore, but John Robinson was invited, for example, to Erasmus University to give lectures. But yeah, since the 1980s and 90s, the neoclassical paradigm has become dominant. And the problem with that, with which we got stuck today, is that turned us blind and actually powerless and helpless to alternatives. When they are not taught anymore to students, then we deliver economists who have no idea about the richness of economic ideas of the past. So where should they start? And then they fall into the trap of this myth about capitalism, that first, capitalism and the market is the same, and obviously nobody wants to abolish markets. And second, that, well, if you want to do something like a different market along the lines of Marx, communism, state-led communism, the Soviet Union model is the only alternative. Yeah. So that's why I think it is so important, and it's one of the reasons why it's so important that economic education becomes much more diverse, with a variety of perspectives, also perspectives with which I, for example, would not feel familiar with or think it is in any way helpful to address the environmental crisis, for example. So the whole range, Smith, Marx, Robinson, Keynes, Veblen, but also the Austrians, Menger, for example. I think delivering a broader perspective to students will, in the end, generate better equipped economists in our society.
Lastly, Ms. van Staveren, what advice would you give to young people who want to study economics these days?
Be very critical to which economic department you go, and sometimes you're better off with an interdisciplinary department rather than with a purely economics department. So there are, for example, you can do bachelor's as well as master's in political economy, which combines economics and philosophy and political science. Or you could choose to go to a development school where I work, for example. Development economics is much more interdisciplinary. So I would advise students to make a choice based on comparing economics education within the Netherlands and outside.
Thank you very much.